was the Witchfinder General?
The Witchfinder General was a young man called Matthew Hopkins.
Matthew Hopkins? He went to my school.
This is a different Matthew Hopkins, I hope.
How do you know? He's an IT consultant now.
Welcome to episode 22 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we combine two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring religious fanaticism, the dangers of groupthink, cult mentalities, and also discussing our first folk horror of the series, as well as our first pseudo-documentary. First up, we have Witchfinder General from 1968 and director Michael Reeves, starring Vincent Price, Ian Ogilvy, Hilary Dwyer and Rupert Davies. Then we travel forward in time to 2013 and The Sacrament from director Ty West, starring AJ Bowen, Joe Swanberg, Gene Jones and Amy Seimetz. Along the way, we'll be discussing the all-too-brief career of Michael Reeves, the real Witchfinder, Matthew Hopkins, the career of director Ty West, the rise and fall of media company Vice, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, a shameless plug for a new book that is being released at the end of this month from the quite brilliant team at We Belong Dead. Titled Mods and Shockers, the book brings you reviews and commentary on more than 150 films made in Great Britain in the 1960s, covering studios including Hammer, Amicus and Tygon, who we're talking about today. It also features an article from me on the 1960 Christopher Lee movie City of the Dead, known in the US as Horror Hotel, and is having its launch at the Festival of Fantastic Films in Manchester, England, at the end of this month. You can pre-order copies online now, and I will link the relevant webpage in our show notes. But now it's time to get on with this week's episode, beginning as always with the key sources that I've used for research, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. When discussing Witchfinder General, I have heavily referenced the Michael Reeves biography by Benjamin Halligan that appears in the British filmmaker series from Manchester University Press. I've also referred to the book Witchfinder General that was published by the Devil's Advocate series and written by Ian Cooper. I've also referred to the excellent book Beasts in the Cellar, the exploitation film career of Tony Tenser that was written by John Hamilton and published by Fab Press, and the book Folk Horror on Film, edited by Lewis Bayman and KJ Donnelly and published by Manchester University Press. And when discussing The Sacrament, I have referenced interviews with Ty West, AJ Bowen, Gene Jones and Amy Seimetz. That can be found on the Second Sight Special Edition Blu-ray release of the film. I've also referred to several video interviews given by Ty West and a number of Q&As at various festivals when the film was released. And all of these can be found on YouTube and again will be listed and linked in the show notes. And so, without any further ado, let's get into our first film of the week, which is Witchfinder General. This was released in 1968 and stars Vincent Price, Ian Ogilvy, Hilary Dwyer and Rupert Davies, and was directed and co-written by Michael Reeves. Michael Reeves has become a rather iconic figure in British horror, which is in no doubt down to the impact of this film, and also the fact that he died incredibly young at the age of 25. He only directed 3 movies, one of which, by his own admission, is pretty terrible, one which is interesting, albeit somewhat flawed, and then the final movie, which is of course the one that we are discussing this week. He was born in 1943 in Surrey in England, and very sadly lost his father to a heart attack when he was just 8 years old. This was 2 days before he was due to start at a preparatory boarding school called Kingsmead, and in fact, according to his biography, he went straight from his father's funeral to the Kingsmead School, which was a fairly regimented British school institution. He developed an interest in film from a very early age, which was fueled very much by the movies that were shown in the school library every Saturday evening, though, as you can imagine, given the location, these were not necessarily the most dynamic and exciting movies in the world. In 1956, he actually oversaw an improvement in the school's film programme, compiling lists from films he had identified in numerous magazines, and he eventually gained free rein over the programming. At the same time, he started writing in the school magazine as quote-unquote the critic, offering commentary on the films that had been screened over the term, and also demonstrating a growing fascination with the machinations of filmmaking. By the time he left Kingsmead and relocated to Radley College in 1958, this passion was all-consuming, and he would apparently go on to spend the majority of his time at that establishment sneaking out to watch American movies at the cinema. And it was here that he really developed an interest in a director who would go on to become an undeniable influence on his work, and this was Don Siegel, the director of the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, and this was a film that he would go on to watch repeatedly on a monthly basis. He would later also become fascinated with Siegel's 1964 movie The Killers, a very downbeat neo-noir movie starring Lee Marvin, Angie Dickinson, and Lord help us, Ronald Reagan. Don Siegel had an incredibly pragmatic approach to filmmaking, which was the antithesis of the 1960s art film. His cinema was tough and efficient and lacked pretension, and this was something that would very much become the template for Reeves' own later movies. Moving on from writing reviews in the school newspaper, he started a postal correspondence with Siegel, as well as other directors, and he also started making his own short films. And it was round about this time that he first met the actor Ian Ogilvy, who would go on to star in all 3 of Reeves' subsequent movies. They were introduced by a mutual friend when they were 15, who knew that Reeves wanted to direct and that Ogilvy wanted to act, and shortly after this, they got together and they made their first short film, a black and white and silent movie called Carrion, which was shot in 1958, which featured 3 escaped hooligans, a psychotic attacking a girl in a wheelchair, and a bottle being smashed into somebody's face, a clear foreshadowing then of what was going to follow. And even here, Reeves was beginning to experiment with camera work, attaching the camera to his mother's tea trolley in an effort to create smooth tracking shots. On leaving school, he joined his mother on a trip to Boston to visit family, and once there became incredibly bored with what he referred to as an endless round of Boston tea parties. This led him to take the incredibly confident and rather audacious step of catching a plane to Los Angeles in an attempt to meet his filmmaking hero Don Siegel, using the address on letters that Siegel had sent to him. On arriving in Los Angeles, he says that he barged into Siegel's house, which is possibly less dramatic than it sounds because the director himself wasn't at home. When Siegel did arrive home, he was, unsurprisingly, rather taken aback to find Reeves in his house talking to his wife, but nonetheless let him tag along for a day at the studio, eventually giving him temporary employment as a dialogue director and also letting him stay in his guest room. Following this very brief period of employment with Siegel, he also started working with the film producer Irving Allen, who was both a distant friend of the Reeves family and also vaguely connected through a friend at the Kingsmead School. Following the same confident approach that he had adopted with Siegel, he took to visiting Allen's office on a daily basis, and after 2 weeks was given an opportunity when a props man fell ill. In 1962, he travelled with an Allen production that was going to be shot in Yugoslavia, and this was a movie called The Long Ships, starring Richard Widmark and Sidney Poitier. But midway through the shoot, a list arrived of people who were considered to be political undesirables and who were to be deported, and Reeves' name, for some reason, was among them. On his return to England, he moved to London, and using his previous work with both Siegel and Allen as reference points, found himself working as an assistant director on TV adverts. During this period, when he wasn't on set working, he also began to screen marathon film sessions in his flat, planning daily programs of 4 or 5 films a day. Living on a trust fund from his rather well-to-do family, if you hadn't gathered that by now, he certainly began to exhibit a rather rebellious phase, gaining a reputation as being rather unpleasant or obnoxious, and he was also incredibly short-tempered and opinionated. However, it's also highly likely that this arrogance and short temper was masking other issues. Even in his school days, there was evidence that he suffered from depression, and friends of the time have subsequently commented that there was certainly evidence of mental instability. Sadly, this is something that would trouble him for the rest of his life, and, as we will see, would lead to his untimely death. In 1963, he found himself travelling to Italy to work on the movie Castle of the Living Dead, which stars Christopher Lee and also marked the film debut of Donald Sutherland. His role on the film is under some question. Some prints of the movie do not credit him at all, the US print credits him as an assistant director, and his biography asserts that he was more likely a second-unit director, though he also appears very briefly in a cameo role as one of Christopher Lee's victims. In my opinion, it's not a particularly good film, despite the presence of Lee and Sutherland, who actually plays 3 roles. But if you want to decide for yourself, there are various versions of it available to watch on YouTube. Following completion of this film, he returned to England, and here his doctor found a shadow on one of his lungs. This was an incredibly unusual illness for somebody as young as he was, and although it turned out to be benign, the possibility of an early death triggered him into action. Gathering together as much money as he possibly could, he set about on the script writing and production of his first film as a director, Revenge of the Blood Beast, which is also known in some territories as the She-Beast. Although by this time he had lost touch with Ian Ogilvy, he hadn't forgotten his former friend, and he reached out to the actor's agent and cast him in the lead of the film. Shot in Italy, the film tells of a young English couple whose honeymoon is rudely interrupted when the wife is possessed by the vengeful spirit of an executed 16th century witch. Despite the incredibly low budget, he was also able to secure the talents of the queen of Gothic Italian horror, Barbara Steele, albeit only for one day. Not that he didn't get his money's worth. In later interviews, Steele would go on to say that she was very much tricked into a contract that interpreted one day of work as 24 hours straight. Her role in the film is largely confined to the early scenes before the possession, at which point she is transformed into the She-Beast, a heavily made-up monster that was played by a man called Joe Riley. As you can probably tell from that summary, I don't think it's a very good film, and Reeves himself referred to it as dreadful. To be honest, I think I've only managed to get about 20 minutes into it before giving up, so if you can manage to see it all the way through, you are a far more committed viewer than I am. If you want to see for yourself, you can find it on YouTube, as of the time of recording, under the title She-Beast. But don't say I didn't warn you. Nevertheless, he had directed his first film, which was shown in the UK, Europe, and the US, and this led to his next film, the much better The Sorcerers, which was filmed in 1967. Produced by the fledgling British horror studio Tygon Productions, this stars the great Boris Karloff, alongside Catherine Lacey and once again Ian Ogilvy. The movie tells the story of an elderly hypnotist played by Karloff called Professor Montserrat, who, together with his wife Estelle, discovers a way to project their consciousness into the mind of a young man, played, of course, by Ogilvy. It's all fun and games at first as they live vicariously through his experiences, savouring the youth and vitality that they've long lost. But soon it all becomes very dark, with the elderly Estelle Montserrat, played by Catherine Lacey, descending into moral decay, depravity and violence, encouraging their young subject to commit greater and greater horrors. And with its narrative of a corrupt older generation inserting their consciousness into the mind of another and exposing the degenerate nature of their personalities as they do so, in some ways it can be seen as anticipating a film like Get Out from 2017. It's not without its flaws. Some of the dialogue simply explains what we can quite clearly see for ourselves on the screen. The pacing is a little bit off. The 1960s psychedelia is incredibly dated, and don't get me started on the technology that the Montserrats used to take control of Ogilvy. But it's a fascinating concept and an incredibly cynical and downbeat film, foreshadowing one of the central ideas of Witchfinder General. And this is the notion of the older generation corrupting and destroying the young for their own selfish and depraved ends, suggesting that the real horror lies not with monsters or ghosts, but in the moral decay of ordinary people. The film was relatively well received, with the Monthly Film Bulletin saying, quote, "Reeves manages to build a considerable charge, particularly in the second half of the film, with a superbly baleful performance by Catherine Lacey, and a script which comes as close to authentic sadism as anything since Peeping Tom." End quote. The publication Films and Filming would say quite correctly that the film's surface appearance would date quickly, but went on to suggest that anyone in the future looking for a reference to youth culture of the 1960s would find it more here than in other films that were more consciously created around the subject. It was selected as the British entry for the 6th International Festival of Science Fiction, where it picked up a Golden Asteroid Award in June 1968, and a Silver Asteroid Award went to Catherine Lacey, who, by all accounts, was not particularly fond of the film or of her role in it. It also took the grand prize at the San Sebastian Science Fiction Film Festival and was sold to Allied artists, opening in the US in January 1968. Its success would lead to Reeves' third and final movie, also made for Tygon, which is, of course, Witchfinder General. And now we are getting into spoilers, so if you have yet to see Witchfinder General, as of the time of recording, you can watch it free of charge on YouTube, but it's also available for rental on most streaming services. The head of Tygon Productions was a man called Tony Tenser, and he had just bought the rights to a 1966 paperback called Witchfinder General. This told the fictionalized version of a story of Matthew Hopkins, a witch hunter who terrorized Essex, Suffolk, and the eastern counties of England during the mid-1600s. Although the novel has been described as turgid and tedious lowbrow popular history, Tenser believed it could form the basis of a good film. Reeves wrote an outline based on the novel, which Tenser approved, and then requested a full film script. Very little is known about Matthew Hopkins' life before he became the notorious figure that he is today. Some ascribe his remarkable cruelty to religious mania, others to sadism, and others still to opportunism and financial gain. But the fact of the matter was that he wouldn't have risen and been able to commit the awful deeds that he did had the environment at the time not been ready and willing to accept him. Hopkins was most likely born around 1620 in Suffolk, England, and he was probably the son of a local vicar. There has been some speculation that he trained as a lawyer, though there is no real evidence to support this. But what we do know about him is that by the early 1640s he had moved to the Manningtree area of Essex in England and had bought himself an inn, the profits of which allowed him to live a semi-comfortable life without the inconvenience of having to work for a living. At this time, England's legal framework against witchcraft had been in place for decades, firstly in a Statute of Parliament in 1563, which was then strengthened in 1604 under King James I. But in practice, alleged harm by witchcraft was prosecuted in secular courts, and trials were heard by what were known as assize judges, who travelled the country, applying procedure and evidentiary standards, which typically prevented large cascades of accusations and convictions. But by the 1640s, England had fallen into civil war. The assize courts were abandoned, communities became insular and isolated, also suffering from famine, and things, unfortunately, began to change. In 1645, 3 years after the outbreak of civil war, a woman in Manningtree was accused of witchcraft. Her name was Elizabeth Clark. She was 80 years old, and she was accused by a local tailor called John Rivet who claimed that she had cursed his wife. Whilst this may seem a rather ridiculous accusation these days, it's important to remember that by this time the country was in disarray from the war, and it was far easier to blame one's problems, such as sickness, the death of a child, or a poor harvest, on witchcraft than it was to look closer to home, or indeed at oneself. It is, after all, always other people that are to blame for our problems and our bad luck. Clark was arrested, and at this point, for some reason, which is not particularly clear, Hopkins became involved in the case. By this time, he had begun a working relationship with an older man called John Stern, and the two had decided that it was their God-given right to force a confession from the poor woman. In his original script, Reeves chose to portray Hopkins as an opportunistic failure, a degenerate individual who was ineffective, inadequate, bitter, and ugly, certainly not the imposing figure that we see on screen in the finished production. There was even a scene in the original screenplay showing him attempting to mount his horse, only to fall straight off, much to the amusement and derisive laughter of onlooking villagers. More importantly, when writing the screenplay with his co-writer Tom Baker, Reeves already had the ideal actor in mind, Donald Pleasance. They even met with Pleasance and offered him the part, which he accepted, and following this the two writers constructed their adaptation around him, building the character and the film around Pleasance's on-screen persona. In the original screenplay, Hopkins was very much the central character, but was a snivelling and self-pitying narcissist, an ignorant and stupid man who in different times would never have risen to power. Ultimately, the original idea was to depict Hopkins as personifying the banality of evil. However, this was not to be. To secure funding for the film, Tygon had gone into co-production with American International Pictures, the home of Roger Corman, the Edgar Allan Poe series, and of course the great Vincent Price. AIP were looking for another vehicle in which to cast their star and insisted that he be given the lead. Given that they were providing half of the budget, they were very much calling the shots, and Reeves was not impressed. He deliberately snubbed the actor by refusing to meet him at the airport as the studio had requested, and Price later recounted that their first meeting was difficult to say the least, with Reeves saying, quote, "I didn't want you, I still don't want you, but I'm stuck with you," end quote. So, hardly an auspicious start to their working relationship. I'll be talking about Vincent Price later in the series, so I'm not going to go into a biography here, but I think it's fair to say that his screen presence is about as far removed from Reeves' original vision of Hopkins as is humanly possible. The casting forced Reeves and Baker into rewrites, completely changing the shape and tone of the film that they wanted to make. The main focus of the new screenplay shifted from Hopkins to our nominal hero, Richard, who would be played again by Ian Ogilvy, and the character of the Witchfinder was rewritten drastically to fit Price's screen presence. Frustrated and angry that his film had been forced to change before it even began, Reeves made sure that the shoot itself was not a happy one for the actor, with his direction focusing heavily on the negative. As Ian Ogilvy recalled in a later interview, quote, "Mike didn't like directing actors at all. He liked casting right. He always said he didn't know anything about acting, so he used Don Siegel's trick. Don Siegel was his great hero, and he believed that if you cast a thing properly, you can leave the actors alone. But Mike found that he was unable to leave Vincent alone. Mike's directions tended to be just, can you do it faster? But with Vincent, it was always, can you please not do that? It was always in the negative, which is a little off-putting for actors." End quote. Taking great umbrage to the way in which this 23-year-old upstart was directing him, Price is alleged to have said, "Young man, I have made 34 films. How many have you made?" To which Reeves reportedly replied, 2 good ones. To his credit, Price is reported to have laughed more than anybody else. And, if we're honest, calling the She-Beast a good movie is pushing his luck, just a little bit. Nevertheless, this is widely acknowledged to be one of Vincent Price's greatest performances, less of a caricature and more of a 3-dimensional character, though, to be honest, it is rather hard to see him as anybody else but Vincent Price, which is both the legacy and the curse of horror superstardom. Although the common understanding is that Hopkins would use physical torture, such as red-hot irons, the truth is rather closer to the interrogation methods that are employed by various governments today. Hopkins in particular used a technique called watching, which was essentially sleep deprivation. But he would also force people to exercise for hours on end until they collapsed from exhaustion, deprive them of food, and force them to sit in cramped and muscle-spasming positions, all while urging them to confess. And these were certainly the techniques that he employed with the unfortunate Elizabeth Clark. But just to be sure he got a full conviction, he also claimed that across her interrogation she summoned witches' familiars, which is, of course, an absolute nonsense, and goes quite some way towards justifying the argument that he was a sadistic and opportunistic bastard. By the end of the ordeal, Clark had not only confessed herself, but had also implicated many other women from Manningtree, who were in turn arrested and subjected to interrogation. As a result, 36 women were accused of witchcraft, and of those 36, 18 were hanged. This formed the catalyst for the rest of Hopkins' career, which particularly flourished along the east coast of England. This region of the country was dominated by Puritans, a particularly severe form of Christianity that sought to outlaw not only witchcraft, but all forms of entertainment, including music, dancing, and theatre, as well as eliminating the scourge of Catholicism. And it's particularly important to bear this in mind when we consider that Hopkins and his colleague Stern only went into villages and towns where they were invited, profiting from the Puritanism movement and the hysteria that was dominating the country at a time where there were no checks and balances to hold it in place. And we can see this sense of religious persecution and hysteria in the film. Hopkins and Stern are welcomed into the town of Lavenham by a character who says he represents the town, and several writers have suggested that Witchfinder General is less folk horror and more a movie about the horror of the folk, with writer Ian Cooper stating that, quote, "The depiction of the populace, not as an amorphous, essentially decent group of people, but rather as a baleful, ignorant mass, is a disturbing one, because it subverts a fundamental convention of the horror film. For Reeves, the monster is not an aberration in an otherwise ordered world. It is the world itself, which is monstrous." End quote. The opening narration of the film very much sets the scene. In a time where the superstitions of country folk are still a powerful factor, Hopkins plays upon them, torturing and killing in a supposed drive to eliminate witchcraft from the country, and doing so with the full blessing of what law there is. Hopkins pronounced himself Witchfinder General. He and Stern set out together firstly through the area of Essex and then through into the counties of Suffolk and Norfolk, invited into local communities where they would torture suspects into confession by breaking them both mentally and physically. Hopkins himself never executed anybody, but once they had confessed and the confessions were written down, the victims were handed over to what we would now call a kangaroo court, which would try them and usually sentence them to death. Whether Hopkins truly believed he was carrying out God's work is not really known, but we do know that it was an incredibly profitable exercise. At a time when the average labourer's wage was a mere 6p a day, Hopkins and Stern would be paid a witchfinder's fee of anywhere between £6 and £23 per village. It is estimated that Hopkins himself made £1,000 during his career as a witchfinder, and this would be worth approximately £180,000 today, proving that there was certainly money to be made in torture. In the movie, we never really learn the details of the accusations against the accused. We only understand that they have been identified as a dangerous other and must be put to death. And of course, this is really the point. These people have really done nothing, save for being convenient scapegoats for society's problems, and as such are the victims of projection and deflection. In addition, Hopkins himself does comment in the movie, rather dryly, that it is strange how much iniquity the Lord has invested in the female, highlighting that it is very much a patriarchal society which sees women as a threat, or, in the case of Sarah, a sexual object to be dominated, used, and discarded. The hypocrisy of supposed men of God is written large across the entirety of the film. Hopkins is lecherous and predatory, and Stern is a rapist thug. Not that the real-life victims were all women. The pair were also responsible for the execution of approximately 20 men for witchcraft, though this number is, of course, disproportionately small when compared to his female victims. It is estimated that Hopkins was responsible for the execution of over 200 women across a period of roughly 1.5 years. Although historians have criticised the movie for being inaccurate, two of the most notorious cases of Hopkins' career are depicted in the film, the first being the execution by hanging of John Lowes, a vicar at Brandeston. In the film, he is played by Rupert Davies, an actor who we discussed briefly back in episode 3 when we talked about the Pete Walker movie Frightmare. Although the character of his niece Sarah and her lover Richard are fictional, there is nothing fictional at all about the fate that befalls Lowes in the movie. He was, in real life, the 70-year-old vicar of Brandeston, and he was accused of witchcraft by his parishioners despite a lack of evidence. To gain a confession, Hopkins subjected him to various forms of torture, including being denied sleep for days, being forced to walk until his feet were blistered, and then being tied to a chair and thrown into a moat to see if he would float. Completely broken, he eventually confessed to using witchcraft in order to sink ships and cause storms, and he was hanged at Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk in 1645. The second case that we see in the film was that of Mary Lakeland, who, after confessing under his interrogations, was neither hanged or imprisoned, but was burned alive, while Hopkins and Stern rode away and counted their money. These two scenes, along with the climax, are the most brutal of the film, though it must be said that the original screenplay was apparently far more violent. Shot in a cold, almost documentary manner, the brutality and violence is juxtaposed with the beauty of the English countryside, and it is this which makes the movie so memorable, and also what made it so incredibly objectionable to the censors of the time. There have been many arguments made that Reeves was depicting violence with a purpose, not least by Reeves himself, who wrote a lengthy letter to the censor when they discussed cutting parts of the movie, saying, "In order for the film to retain its point, there must be a level of brutality throughout. By seducing the audience into accepting it, we prime them for the ending, where the stool is whipped right from under their feet and they are left looking at themselves and their involvement with the foregoing violence. If the film is cut to an acceptable level of violence, this ending will lose all point and become merely horror comic, and that is what both you and I so wish to avoid." Now, whether you actually believe him is entirely up to you, but it's worth pointing out that his colleagues on the film were slightly more cynical about his approach to violence. They suggested that the impassioned plea for artistic integrity was more to get his film released as he had intended than any real belief in what he was saying. His co-writer Tom Baker certainly thought so, as did Ian Ogilvy, who said, quote, "He was much more interested in making an exciting movie than imposing moral questions on the treatment of violence." End quote. In the film, Hopkins meets a remarkably violent end, hacked to death by the vengeful Richard, who has been quite literally broken by the violence that he has experienced, witnessed, and also delivered. Suggesting that violence and hysteria are contagious, the ending is impossibly bleak, with Richard screaming angrily when Hopkins is put out of his misery and in effect stolen from him. In attempting to fight the monster, Richard has become the monster himself, moving from naive innocent at the start of the movie to something almost as monstrous as his adversary. It's hard to imagine a bleaker ending to the movie, as our hero and heroine are completely destroyed, with little to no hope of ever returning. Fortunately for the real Hopkins, but sadly for anybody with a sense of justice, this is not how his life ended in reality. And whilst there have been some legends that he himself ended up being accused of witchcraft and executed for the crime, this was also not the case. Parliament started to hear word of the mass trials and executions, which is hardly surprising given the extent of them, and Hopkins was summoned before them and accused of torture. By now, the famine caused by the war was ending, and the societal conditions that had allowed Hopkins to flourish had begun to dissipate. Public opinion was finally turning against him. Pamphlets began to be published condemning his actions, and it wasn't long until he was thoroughly discredited. The self-proclaimed Witchfinder General, still only in his 20s, retired back to Essex, and within a few months died of tuberculosis. Sadly, this was not before he had published his own book, A Discovery of Witches, which outlined his methodology and also aimed to dispel persistent rumours that he himself was in league with Satan. Eventually, this book found its way to the Puritans in the New World, and there has been much speculation that it partly contributed to the Salem witch trials of 1692. Sadly, the reach of Matthew Hopkins appears to have lasted much longer than his life. Filming on Witchfinder General ran from mid-September to mid-November 1967 and took place on location in the counties that Hopkins himself had once terrorised. The tension between Reeves and Price did not improve across the duration of the shoot, and at one point Price was instructed to shoot a pistol while still mounted on his horse. Price objected, knowing that this would terrify the animal, but Reeves was insistent. The horse bolted, and Price was thrown to the floor. It should be said that, apart from Reeves, the rest of the cast and crew seemed to have adored him. He even cooked a dinner for the entire production of 60 when the catering team failed to arrive for shooting. That being said, there was also one occasion where he enjoyed himself a little bit too much. Relieved to be reaching the end of the shoot, Price began celebrating early and arrived for the final scene very much the worse for alcohol. Reeves was furious and reportedly instructed Ogilvy to really lay into Price during the final climax. This was a final and brutal act of revenge from the director for a production decision that was hardly Vincent Price's fault to begin with. Reeves may have been a young genius, but his lack of maturity certainly showed in his relationship to his leading man. On completion of filming, the movie was subjected to the British Film Censor, and as I mentioned earlier, they were not happy with the level of violence. Despite Reeves' letter, they ordered a number of scenes to be cut or removed altogether, but even with these cuts, the violence, cruelty and horror of the film was very shocking for audiences of the time. On its release, critics were greatly divided. The Times, the Monthly Film Bulletin, and Films and Filming were complimentary, but others were not so enamoured with either the movie or its message. Perhaps the biggest critic of the time was the playwright Alan Bennett, who was then the film reviewer at the Listener magazine, and who called it, quote, "the most persistently sadistic and morally rotten film I have seen. It was a degrading experience, by which I mean it made me feel dirty. I would not have wasted space on such a shambles had the film not received such serious and favourable critical attention in certain quarters." End quote. Perhaps rather characteristically, Reeves decided to respond, writing a furious response which was printed in the next issue of The Listener. He described Bennett's critique as a, quote, "vitriolic condemnation of my film and of the two critics who are kind enough to praise it." End quote. He went on to say that he believed violence to be horrible, degrading, and that if it is going to be shown on screen at all, it should be presented as such. His letter concluded wishing that he could have witnessed Alan Bennett frantically attempting to wash away the dirty feeling that the film gave him, as this would have been proof that the movie had the effect that he had always intended it to have. Fair enough. For its American release, AIP retitled the movie The Conqueror Worm, after a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, trying to link it to their Vincent Price Poe series of movies. Of this change, Reeves appears to have been somewhat philosophical, saying, "What the hell, it's still our movie, they haven't changed that." The US critics were equally as divided as the British ones, though they took it far less seriously. Variety said that Reeves' scripting and direction was mediocre, but did say that Ogilvy was quote-unquote somewhat dashing. The New York Times suggested that the cast had been selected purely for their ability to scream, and the Hollywood Citizen News echoed the words of Alan Bennett, calling the movie a disgrace to the producers and scripters and a sad commentary on the art of filmmaking. Financially, in the UK, Witchfinder General didn't exactly set the box office alight. Despite its notoriety and the controversy surrounding its violence, thank you, Alan Bennett, it performed just adequately. Its low budget, around £83,000, meant that it didn't need to be a blockbuster to break even, but overall the domestic returns were rather underwhelming. Meanwhile, in the US, it was sold much more on Vincent Price's name as well as Edgar Allan Poe, and so it fared much better, with AIP reporting box office of around 1.5 million. As we now know, of course, it has become a cornerstone of the folk horror movement, and sits alongside Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971 and 1973's The Wicker Man as one of the so-called unholy trinity of the genre. For his part, Vincent Price was actually happy with the end result, if not the process of making the film itself. On its release, he wrote to Reeves to congratulate him on what he called an impressive, moving and exciting film. Praising the juxtaposition of the English countryside and the brutality, he went on to say, quote, "So, my dear Michael, in spite of the fact that we didn't get along too well, I do think that you have made a very fine picture, and what's more, I liked what you gave me to do." End quote. Witchfinder General would be Michael Reeves' final film. In 1968, he was offered an opportunity by AIP to direct Vincent Price once again in another supposed Edgar Allan Poe adaptation. This was The Oblong Box, which would also star Hilary Dwyer, who played Sarah, and Rupert Davies, who played Reverend Lowe. But Reeves was uninspired by both the script and reportedly increasingly frustrated by the production. As I mentioned, he had long been troubled by mental health issues, which may also have accounted for some of his more erratic behaviour through his life and towards Price on his final movie. He confided to a friend that he was undergoing electric shock treatments in a private hospital, and shortly before production on The Oblong Box began, drunk and despairing, he took 4 or 5 capsules of an antidepressant and washed them down with more alcohol. Although he survived, it was enough for AIP to remove him from the production. Following this, his mental state continued to deteriorate, and friends described him as being hyper, tense, and brittle. On the morning of the 11th of February 1969, his cleaning lady found him unconscious in his London flat. 2 bottles of pills were by the bed, along with an empty bottle of alcohol. There has, of course, been much speculation that this was suicide, but the coroner's verdict ruled an accidental overdose. He was cremated in a private service on the 20th of February 1969 at Ipswich Crematorium. His hero, Don Siegel, wrote to a friend later that year, "I am dreadfully shocked at the sad news. It's extremely difficult for me to comment about Michael Reeves. He was so young and so full of promise. I always felt that he would have many fruitful and enjoyable years as a director of great potential. I realise that his youth made him terribly strong in his demands for the future, but I saw in Michael many of my own faults, and I hope that, without being fatuous, I could have been of some help to him." We now move on to our second film of the week, which is another exploration of religious fanaticism and the dangers of groupthink, which is The Sacrament from director Ty West. This was released in 2013 and stars A.J. Bowen, Joe Swanberg, Gene Jones, and Amy Seimetz. Ty West was born in Delaware in 1980 and comes from what he's described as a perfectly ordinary suburban and middle-class background. His real interest in films began when he enrolled in a film history class in high school, which, unlike Michael Reeves, was not out of burning artistic ambition, but more because he assumed it would be an easy option and give him a chance to sit and watch movies all day. As it turned out, though, that bit of teenage laziness was rather life-changing. Although he had enjoyed film as an observer, This class introduced him to the idea of cinema as something to be studied and understood, and he later said it was both the first subject at school that excited him and also the first thing that he was any good at. So I guess the moral of the story is never underestimate the easy option. After high school, he moved to New York to study film at the School of Visual Arts, where one of his professors was the independent filmmaker Kelly Reichardt. Reichardt would often introduce her students to a range of directors whose work reflected the possibilities of low-budget filmmaking, and it was through her that West was first introduced to Larry Fessenden, a filmmaker and actor known for his distinctive approach to horror and his commitment to independent movies. Reichardt gave West Fessenden's phone number, noting that he was really the only student that was genuinely eager to meet him. And this introduction would prove crucial, marking the beginning of a long-standing creative relationship that would shape the early years of his career. After graduating, it was Fessenden who gave West the money to make his first movie, The Roost, and he says that had it not been for that relationship, he's really not sure whether he would ever have made the first step himself. Released in 2005, The Roost is a homage to late-night horror. Its central story is framed by a horror host on a fictional TV show called Frightmare Theatre. The host is played by Tom Noonan, best known for his roles as the Tooth Fairy in Manhunter in 1986, as well as Frankenstein's monster in 1987's The Monster Squad and the hacker in Heat in 1995. Following his introduction, we are introduced to four friends who become trapped in a barn and are attacked first by a swarm of monstrous bats and later by a group of zombies. I first saw it round about 2006 on DVD and I haven't seen it since, so given that it was 20 years ago, my recall really isn't particularly reliable. I do remember, though, finding it incredibly strange. He followed this in 2007, again working with Larry Fessenden's production company with a film called Triggerman. This is described as a compact and radical survival thriller and follows a group of friends on a hunting trip who find themselves becoming the hunted. I have never seen it and I cannot comment on it at all, so we will move on to the next film that he directed, albeit it's one that he probably wishes he hadn't. This is Cabin Fever 2 Spring Fever, and was the follow-up to Eli Roth's debut movie Cabin Fever that was released in 2002. The sequel began filming in 2007, but wouldn't be released until 2009, and when it was in a form that bore no resemblance at all to the movie that West had written and directed. Saying that it was originally going to be the weirdest follow-up ever, he set out to make an insane, over-the-top, gross-out comedy horror, very much in the vein of John Waters or Paul Bartel, all of which was done with the studio's blessing. He has recalled that the first 4 months of filming were among the best filmmaking experiences of his life. But then the studio Lionsgate went from saying he could do anything that he wanted to deciding that that's not what they wanted anymore. The edit was given to somebody else who completely recut the movie and also shot additional sequences, and West has said that the film ended up in what he called Alan Smithy territory. Alan Smithy was the pseudonym that used to be used by film directors who wanted to disown a project, but that practice was sadly discontinued by the Directors Guild of America in the year 2000. So I think it's fair to say that this was a less than happy experience for him. That being said, he's often described filmmaking itself as being traumatic, saying that the only part he really enjoys is coming up with the initial idea. And once I've told the idea, he says, that's cool, I'm good, I'm done. I feel like I've already accomplished what I was thinking about. He went on to say that turning the idea into a finished film often feels like reliving the same conversation for 2 years, with each stage of production feeling the worst while he's in it, but when it's done, on reflection, it was the best. Writing, he says, is traumatic and difficult, but once filming begins, he misses the solitude of writing. During production, he misses the quiet of editing, and in editing, he longs for the energy of filming. For him, it's really something of a grass is greener situation. In interviews, he has said that the magic of cinema comes from the weird telepathy between the director and the audience, and that the wonder is in discovering that another person shares the same ideas and thoughts as you do. He's gone on to say that for him, there are two types of filmmaker, those who make movies for themselves and those who make movies totally for their audiences. And as I'm sure you can guess, he believes himself to be firmly in the first camp. He has called this personal filmmaking, where you have an idea in your head that is so strong you have no choice but to make it a reality through committing it to screen. Whilst he would obviously like people to watch and appreciate and connect with his work, he is making it first and foremost for himself, essentially trying to exorcise an image or thought that has been nagging at his brain until it can be committed to film. And following the cabin fever shoot, the idea that began nagging at his brain next was that of a 1980s throwback satanic panic cult movie, a thought that took form as The House of the Devil, released in 2009, coincidentally the same year as the ill-fated Cabin Fever 2. Starring Jocelyn Donahue, A.J. Bowen, Tom Noonan, ex-Andy Warhol superstar Mary Woronov, and a pre-Barbie Greta Gerwig, the film is a meticulously crafted homage to early 80s horror, following a college student who accepts a seemingly harmless babysitting job that reveals itself to be more of a satanic ritual. Made with great attention to period detail, it confused more than a few people into believing that it was actually made in the 1980s, which is a fine compliment indeed, and it was also probably the film that truly put him on the radar of wider audiences. It was widely praised by critics and won several awards, including Best Screenplay and Best Actress at the Toronto After Dark Film Festival, and it also earned him a reputation as a director of quote-unquote slow burn horror. Not that he has agreed with this labelling, saying in a 2010 interview, quote, "I hate the term slow burn. I'm not making these movies to see people get killed, so I'm not in a hurry to get there. If there isn't a strong contrast between the horrific elements of the movie and the non-horrific elements, it just becomes this blah milquetoast thing." Following this, in 2011, he delivered another character-driven horror with The Innkeepers, a ghost story inspired by the location shoot for House of the Devil. Starring Sarah Paxton, Pat Healy, Kelly McGillis, and Lena Dunham, The Innkeepers tells of two employees at an inn who spend its closing weekend trying to hunt its resident ghost and who get more than they bargained for. It's a very effective modern-day take on an old-fashioned ghost story, and is a good one to watch for Halloween if you're looking, by the way. The same year, he also cameoed in Adam Wingard's home invasion comedy horror You're Next, in which he played a pretentious filmmaker who gets his comeuppance fairly early on. This reunited him with House of the Devil actor A.J. Bowen, as well as fellow independent director and actor Joe Swanberg, both of whom would show up in The Sacrament. Following this, he directed segments in 2012's anthology movies The ABCs of Death and VHS, before starting work on the second of this week's movies. And now it's that time that we are about to get into spoilers, so if you haven't seen The Sacrament, then as always, please proceed with caution, because I'm about to give the entire plot away. The Sacrament is, of course, very loosely based on the Jonestown tragedy in Guyana, when, on November the 18th, 1978, a total of 918 people died at the People's Temple, a cult run by the Reverend Jim Jones. After much thought, I have decided to not speak in any great detail about what happened in Jonestown, as I feel within the time frame of this episode I could really not do the story justice. And in addition, this is a horror and, I guess, social history podcast as opposed to true crime. There are, of course, many, many true crime podcasts out there who have covered the story to greater or lesser success, and so if you want to find out what really happened back in the late 1970s, it really wouldn't take you that long to do so. West has been entirely transparent about the film's inspiration, explaining that he wanted to take a real historical event and also a real-world organisation, and use them as the central axis around which to construct his narrative. He wanted to show that people who join cults are not the stereotypical white-robed weirdos that many would have you believe, and are instead real people with real lives, real histories, and real families. In addition, he also wanted to explore how an event such as this would be handled in present day by a real-world media company, and the media company that he chose to depict was Vice. Vice began as the Voice of Montreal in 1994 and was a free alternative culture magazine created by Soroush Alvi, Gavin McGuinness and Shane Smith. In 1999, after investment, it was rebranded Vice and moved to New York, and then grew into web, video and global editions. In 2006, on the advice of creative director Spike Jonze, Vice began expanding into digital video, launching a new service, VBS.TV, as a joint venture with MTV Networks, and they quickly gained a large fan base with shows like the Vice Guide to Travel. 2 years later, in 2008, co-founder Gavin McGuinness would leave the company due to creative differences, and as we all probably know by now, went on to become a far-right activist, founding the organisation The Proud Boys. The Vice Guide to series showcased the concept of immersion journalism, and that's something that is referenced in the opening title card of the movie. This put small film crews directly into hard-to-reach places, staying very close to their subjects, narrating in first person, and filming very quickly with handheld camera work so that the audience felt present in the scene. The upside to this was vivid access to underreported stories, but the downside was the risk of spectacle over context, something that became all too apparent as they explored areas including North Korea, the gun markets of Pakistan, the Congo and Liberia. Criticised widely for trading in sensationalism and celebrating spectacle over nuance, as well as promoting misery tourism, things continued in the same vein into the early 2010s, with a documentary about Japan's so-called suicide forest and a highly controversial publicity stunt, again in North Korea, featuring basketball star Dennis Rodman. But the controversy was good for business, and in 2013, 21st Century Fox invested $70 million for a 5% stake, giving you an idea of how far the organisation's reach was spreading. And in the same year, they premiered a 30-minute news programme for HBO titled Vice News. They followed this a year later with the Vice News channel, which almost immediately claimed global attention for its coverage of protest and conflict in Ukraine and Venezuela. In the same year, A&E Networks, the TV group jointly owned by the Walt Disney Company and the Hearst Corporation, invested $250 million for a 10% stake of the company, and then a year later, Disney made 2 additional investments of $200 million each to gain a bigger stake. Immersion may have been questionable, but it was certainly good for business. In 2017, they received a further $450 million investment from a private equity firm, and the company was valued at $5.7 billion. But beneath the profit was a far more disturbing underbelly. In the same year as their multi-billion valuation, the New York Times reported several settlements involving allegations of sexual harassment, and over 20 women stated that they had experienced or witnessed sexual misconduct whilst working for the company. In a statement provided to the New York Times, co-founders Smith and Alvi said, quote, "From the top down, we have failed as a company to create a safe and inclusive workspace where everyone, especially women, can feel respected and thrive." End quote. Despite this announcement, controversies continued, and investors started to get nervous. Disney publicly announced that their investment was worth far less than they had hoped, and this was a major red flag. Online ads were beginning to dry up, and Vice was running a very expensive operation. Lots of websites, a big news team, offices around the world, and a cable TV channel. And all of that cost a lot more than the money that was coming in. In 2019, HBO cancelled Vice News Tonight, which had been the company's shop window to their mainstream audience. Vice tried to keep growing, but 2020's ad slump and the pandemic really began to hit hard. Layoffs and reshuffles followed as the company tried different ways to make money, making shows for other networks and brands, selling sponsorships, and trying to keep its US cable channel going. By May 2023, the bills were too big, and Vice filed for bankruptcy protection and was sold to its lenders for a fraction of its old headline value. In 2024, they stopped publishing new articles on Vice.com and cut several hundred jobs. What's left today is mainly a production studio that makes documentaries and series for other people, plus the Vice TV cable channel. It still exists, but it's really no longer the big force that it was in the mid-2010s. So back in 2011, when West started drafting the screenplay, Vice was very much a groundbreaking media outlet, and their immersion approach was at its height. And although the movie was inspired by the director's long-standing interest in cults and religious movements, he really wanted to explore the theme through a modern lens, imagining how such events might unfold in the age of digital media and gonzo journalism. And in doing so, the film poses some very interesting questions about the nature of the medium itself and the morality of the immersion approach, asking whether it's immersion or invasion, and questioning the value of pursuing a story at any cost. What we are watching is not, as I erroneously said at the end of last week's episode, found footage, but is in fact a faux documentary, one which the team at Vice have edited, scored, and released for a profit. And whilst it becomes apparent as the film progresses that all is really not as it seems at Eden Parish, it is because of the invasion of the Vice team that the massacre actually happens. They have gone from documenting to participating to exacerbating the situation. And whilst the film is essentially the Vice Guide to Jonestown, to be fair to the company, after giving their permission for the name to be used, they didn't really have many stipulations or interfere that much in the production, although they did insist that characters playing their journalists should not be depicted holding or shooting guns. Having the main characters as documentarians also allows West to shoot something that is a little bit more cinematic than the typical found footage movie, and also, very importantly, gives the characters a reason to continue filming. After all, these are gonzo journalists who are very used to filming in war zones and extreme conditions, and so in this movie it actually makes sense that they would continue filming even as the horrors unfold. Taking a documentary approach, though, did cause an unexpected problem for the director. He has said that it was harder to edit than his previous films, and it really gave him an appreciation as to the amount of effort and work that goes into editing actual documentaries. Before the screenplay was completed, West explained the basic concept of the movie to Eli Roth, who told him that he could get financing purely on the strength of his initial pitch. This indeed proved to be the case, and with Roth on board as executive producer, pre-production began in earnest. West has said that this was an extremely positive relationship because of Roth's own directing background, and that he essentially cleared the way for West to make the film that he wanted to make, ensuring that he had the resources he needed and also giving him the final cut. And, as we know from Cabin Fever 2 and other episodes in this series, that is a very rare thing indeed. Apart from Gene Jones in the role of father, West already knew most of the cast of the movie personally and was either friends with them or had already worked with them in some capacity. This enabled him to write the movie specifically for them, giving the characters' voices, vocabulary and reactions a grounding in reality that makes the film all the more effective. This also meant that were they to improvise off script, it would sound all the more natural, as they would just be speaking and acting as different interpretations of themselves. That being said though, all of the actors have said that no improvisation was required, and they all stuck very closely to the text as it was originally written. The fact that Joe Swanberg, who plays the cameraman Jake, is a filmmaker himself, also made these sequences where he was filming the action an easier process. West has said that he could give Swanberg incredibly complex directions as to where he was going and what shots he needed to get and where he should put the camera down, and Swanberg would immediately get it and then deliver on the goods. There was also an added bonus that both Swanberg and West have similar visual tastes, and so they would pick up on the same things when filming organically as well as deliberately. The actors Bowen, Swanberg, Seimetz and Kentucky Sudley as Patrick all give sweatily realistic performances, and special credit must go to Seimetz for her twitchy portrayal of Caroline, particularly in the horrific climax. Her scene where she cradles her brother as he dies is genuinely upsetting, and though Caroline is clearly as much of a victim of father as anyone else, you can't help but want to knock her block off. She reportedly found the scene an arduous one to shoot and was genuinely upset by the experience. And it must be said, it is also genuinely upsetting the extent to which the character of Caroline anticipates real-life figures like Alison Mack, the former Smallville actress who played a key role in the US cult NXIVM. But it has to be said that the success or failure of the film very much sits in the hands of the actor chosen to play father, and here West struck absolute gold. Gene Jones was discovered, if that's the right word, very late in the day, when the cast and crew were already in Savannah, Georgia, setting up pre-production. West happened to see the actor playing a rather minor guest role on a US comedy program, in which he was playing a pharmacist who was talking to a customer, very frankly, about her bowel movements. West apparently took one look and said, "That's the man," and started to track the actor down. If he looks familiar, that may well be because you've seen him in the 2007 Coen Brothers thriller No Country for Old Men, or in his later roles in Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight in 2015, or 2023's The Last Stop in Yuma County. In terms of preparation for the movie, the actor has said that he thought himself far too old to base himself in any way on the real-life Reverend Jim Jones. And so he started to ask himself what type of man would somebody willingly follow into the jungle to start a new life. The answer that came to him was a grandfather figure, and this was the kernel around which the character was built. A grandfather type who outwardly cares for his children, but one who is slowly falling apart due to drug-induced megalomania and paranoia. And although I did say I wasn't going to talk about Jonestown too much in this episode, I think here it's important to note that Jim Jones did not start out as a monster, and by all accounts and reliable reporting, started off as somebody who genuinely wanted to help people. And that, if we're honest, is all the more terrifying. The dramatic high point of the movie is not the incredibly violent and distressing climax, but instead comes midway through the film with the arrival of Father and the interview with the Vice team. And this was also the first time that West and the actor met in person, having only conversed by telephone and video exchange. Due to the nature of the filming setup, it was important to film as much of this interview sequence in one take as possible, but it was 12 pages of script that were due to be filmed in extremely challenging conditions, overnight, and surrounded by 200 extras. Jones had told West that he would aim to learn every line of his dialogue and would attempt to do it in one take, but with the pressures of the situation and the complexity of the dialogue and characters, this seemed like an incredibly big ask. Before the actor arrived on set, West briefed the extras and told them that they were members of Father's family and that they loved him very much and were suspicious and resentful of the Vice crew. This then was their basic direction, and I think it's fair to say that nobody on the set expected what was going to happen next. Firstly, Jones did indeed deliver the dialogue all in one take, and what was proposed to be shot over 2 nights was actually completed in less than 2 hours, including changing the camera and filming again for different pickups. His performance in this scene is masterful, and as West himself has said, it really gives a sense of how and why people would have followed him into the jungle. But equally importantly, the reaction of the extras is phenomenal. With very little direction, they became fully caught up in the reality of the moment. Their reactions to Father's words are spontaneous, as are their physical reactions when he enters at the very beginning. It is an awe-inspiring and terrifying moment, and all credit must go not only to West and to Jones and to AJ Bowen, but also to the 200 extras who pulled out every stop to create a real moment of movie magic. West reflected later that the scene's energy was electric but terrifying, since everything unfolded organically. The instinctive reactions of the crowd reinforced for him the potency and realism of what they were capturing. He went on to say that he greatly appreciated the work that the extras put into the film, saying that they made his job as a director incredibly easy, as most of the things that were happening in the background were, on the whole, improvised, which is, of course, very, very different to the performances of the main characters. This allowed West and his team to find moments where an extra was doing something particularly interesting, ensuring that they captured it on film, and for me, this is one of the reasons that the film holds up so well on second viewing. There's a lot more to observe in the background other than the main narrative. There is, of course, a questionable element about basing a horror film on a real-life tragedy. Whilst the horrors of Witchfinder General occurred over 300 years before Michael Reeves made his movie, the horrors of Jonestown happened in the late 1970s, certainly within my lifetime, and certainly close enough for relatives of the victims to still be alive. As a result, on its release, the film attracted a great deal of controversy and a great deal of criticism. And this is something that is still very relevant, if not more so today, in our world of true crime documentaries and Ryan Murphy miniseries featuring pretty boy serial killers. Across the American and British press, the consensus was while the Sacrament was very technically accomplished, its choice to fictionalise Jonestown so directly left many people uneasy, questioning whether the realism served as a reflection and insight or just a reenactment and entertainment. For his part, West wanted the violence of the movie to be confronting and upsetting, which is similar, in a way, to what Michael Reeves said about the violence in Witchfinder General. The horrors of the final 20 minutes are grimly realistic and very in-your-face. We are spared absolutely nothing, from the death of the smallest children to the suicide of the man who created the nightmare. It's a very upsetting piece of filmmaking, made all the more so because we know it is based on reality. And for my part, I didn't find it sensationalist, but instead a study of what can happen when hope and optimism sour and isolation and groupthink set in. And, incidentally, for listeners of last week's show, one of the biggest critics of the film was the director Paul Schrader, he of the Cat People remake. Clearly forgetting what it's like to be on the receiving end of scathing criticism, he took great offence to the film's themes and, as was the way back then, took directly to Twitter, calling the project in poor taste and generally acting like an old man shouting at a cloud. Perhaps the final word belongs to actor A.J. Bowen, who, in an interview on the second sight Blu-ray release of the film, responded to Paul Schrader's criticism. Bowen said that the filmmakers weren't trying to toy with real people, but rather to explore the culpability of media and how they express events, while also making a sincere effort to humanise the idea of a cult. He went on to explain that, up to that point, society had often dismissed cult members as stupid or foolish people. The goal of the movie, then, was to show how ordinary, decent individuals can find themselves drawn into such situations, and what happens after they've made that choice. Whether or not they've achieved that, I will leave very much down to you. Following the release of The Sacrament, Ty West moved into a different genre by directing a western called In a Valley of Violence, and then into TV work, directing various TV series episodes, including for Scream, South of Hell, Wayward Pines, Outcast, Tales from the Loop, and the vastly underrated TV series The Exorcist. And if you haven't seen that TV series, I know it sounds like a terrible idea, but trust me, it's definitely worth watching, and it's far superior to the more recent attempts to reboot the franchise. Though to be fair, that is rather a low bar. As genre fans will know, he more recently wrote and directed the trilogy X, Pearl and Maxine, all starring Mia Goth, and each taking a distinctly different thematic and stylistic approach to horror, the 1970s slasher, the Technicolor musical, and the Italian giallo. He remains an original and innovative director with a deep understanding of genre history, and according to IMDb, is reportedly now developing a series called Bloodlust, though IMDb isn't the most reliable source in the world sometimes, so perhaps we need to take that with a grain of salt and see what happens. Witchfinder General and The Sacrament both depict isolated communities in disarray, societies ripe for exploitation by opportunistic antagonists. The puritanical religious fervour of 17th century East Anglia became the perfect breeding ground for the sadism of Matthew Hopkins, while the isolation and dependency of Eden Parish allows the influence of Father to take complete control of his followers. In some ways, the Sacrament is a mirror of the world portrayed by Michael Reeves. Hopkins uses societal collapse and chaos as a ladder to rise to power and wealth, while Father uses his power to disintegrate and destroy the society that he himself has built. And while in 17th century England the outsiders are persecuted and destroyed, in Eden Parish the threat of the outsider is used to turn the community inwards, compelling them to engineer their own self-destruction. Both films depict worlds in which all checks and balances have been removed, and where fear, prejudice and bias have become fertile ground for hysteria and hate, and where the irrational quickly supersedes logic. More than that, both suggest that beneath the thin veneer of civilization and normality, anyone is vulnerable to indoctrination, groupthink and control influenced by so-called figures of good. The circumstances just have to be right. And that's a notion that feels chillingly prophetic. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's films, or indeed any of the films we've discussed so far in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow the show on Instagram at thehorrordouble. Next week, we're having a trip into the great outdoors. In the first film, the swamps of Louisiana, and in the second, the Appalachian Mountains. So first up will be Southern Comfort from 1981 and director Walter Hill, starring Powers Booth, Fred Ward, Keith Carradine and Peter Coyote. And then we follow that with The Descent from 2005 and director Neil Marshall, starring Shauna MacDonald, Natalie Mendoza, Alex Reed and Mayanna Buring. And if you want to watch along, you can see Southern Comfort free of charge at the time of recording on the Tubi channel, and it's also available for rent on Amazon Prime. The Descent is currently available for rental on Amazon, and there is also about to be a cinema re-release in 4K. And I have to say, I saw the 4K version at Fright Fest in London this year, and it looks absolutely stunning. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.